Welcome to this presentation on solar radiation, photosynthesis, and its relationship to growth of both cool and warm season turf grasses. Solar energy from the sun sustains life here on Earth. Plants capture the sun's energy and convert it into a usable chemical form through the process known as photosynthesis. The amount of energy that travels to the Earth from the sun is 1,360 watts per meter squared. This value is known as the solar constant. As the sun's energy enters the Earth's atmosphere, some of that energy is lost through absorption or is scattered due to ozone, water vapor, carbon dioxide, or dust. The energy that arrives to the turfgrass leaf is around 900 watts per meter squared. Of this energy, only 45% of it is what we would call photosynthetically active radiation. Photosynthetically active radiation falls within the narrow visible light spectrum of 400 to 700 nanometers. The photosynthetically active wavelengths occur in the blue and red spectrum. It is within the blue and red spectrum that the plant pigments important in photosynthesis, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, are active. Returning to the light spectrum, the energy is in the light particles called photons, which contain the discrete packages of energy called quanta. Not all light particles contain the same energy. For example, the blue photon is at a higher energy state than a red photon, although both are equal in physiological potential. In low light conditions, the relationship differences in the far red quanta to red quanta influences turfgrass growth. To express photosynthetically active radiation on a quantum basis, the units we use are micromoles per meter squared per second. To quantify this brightness or intensity of light within the photosynthetic active radiation, we use the term photosynthetic photon flux density. Light intensities can reach 1,800 to 2,300 micromoles per meter squared per second at sea level on a cloudless day. For cool season turf grasses, the light saturation points range from 534 to 1,072 micromoles per meter squared per second. For warm season turf grasses, the range is from 1,794 to 2,139 micromoles per meter squared per second. Cool season turf grasses, or C3 grasses, reach maximum photosynthetic capacity at about half full sunlight, while warm season turf grasses are much higher. In some cases, it is useful to express the amount of energy over a day or a month. For example, on a clear December day, the photosynthetic photon flux might be close to the same as on a clear day in June, but the photosynthetic photon flux total for the days would be different due to day length. The term daily light integral, or DLI, is used to describe the total quantity of light delivered over an entire day and is measured in moles per meter squared per day. How can we use this information? Researchers at Clemson University determined that a daily light integral of 32.6 mole per meter squared per day was required to provide acceptable turf eagle turf quality on a putting green. In this example, the DLI for acceptable turf eagle quality, shown here by the black line, for Chicago would go from April to August, or maybe a little less than August. Not enough light to sustain TIF eagle in Chicago. Temperature would also be a factor, but the amount of light a warm season turfgrass receives is extremely important in its adaptability. In the case of Phoenix, the acceptable DLI would range from February up to November. Given that the threshold in plotting monthly average daily light intervals, we can get an idea of when and how many months TIF eagle would receive enough light for acceptable growth. We can also look at various turf grasses and see what their daily light integral is and get a feel for their shade tolerance. As previously mentioned, solar energy needs to be converted into a usable form. The process is known as photosynthesis. The overall photosynthetic reaction is given here. Radiant energy is converted into usable energy, which is stored in sugars and carbohydrates. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast, contained within photosynthetic cells. These cells are mainly the mesophyll cells within the leaf. If we look closer at the chloroplast, it contains a thylakoid membrane, which is comprised of stacks of grana. This is where light energy is converted into chemical energy, primarily ATP and NADPH. This reaction is known as a light-dependent reaction. Chlorophyll A and B act to harvest the light energy at this point. The ATP and NADPH are then fed into the chloroplast stroma, substance around the thylakoid membranes, where the light-independent reaction takes place. In the stroma, carbon is brought in from carbon dioxide, and the chemical energy is stored in sugars. The two reactions, light-dependent and independent, are summarized here. The light-dependent reaction, again, is where the sun's energy is converted into chemical energy, ATP and NADPH, which is shuttled to the light-independent reaction, where the energy is eventually stored in sugars and carbohydrates. The core of light-independent reaction is the C3 or Calvin-Benson cycle, where carbon dioxide enters the process and provides carbon for the creation of sugars and carbohydrates. The energy is stored in the carbon bonds, and when the sugars are broken down in respiration, the energy is released for plant metabolic processes. In C4 plants or warm season turf grasses, an additional step is present, referred here as the C4 pathway. The carbon dioxide attaches and is then cycled deeper into the leaf blade, where it is released and then captured in the Calvin-Benson cycle. The C4 pathway is more photosynthetically efficient because carbon dioxide is not wasted, which is the case with cool season turf grasses at high temperatures. However, the C4 pathway requires more energy in the form of higher light intensities. The photosynthetic efficiency at higher light intensities and associated higher temperatures is the reason warm season turf grasses are adapted to tropical and semi-tropical environments compared to cool season turf grasses. The downside for warm season turf grasses is that under shade the light intensities are not high enough to sustain turf quality when compared to cool season turf grasses. The light compensation point, where photosynthesis equals respiration, is much higher for warm season turf grasses compared to cool season turf grasses. The compensation points for cool and warm season turf grasses is shown on this graph. For cool season turf grasses it is 50 to 150, while warm season turf grasses are 200 to 300 micromoles per meter squared per second, or more closely to 300. The impact of shade on warm season turf grasses is shown here in this Bermuda grass rough. The square or rectangular piece of green Bermuda grass sod was just planted, providing a stark contrast to the Bermuda grass that's in the rough that's been there a much longer time. The compensation points may vary among species. In this picture, the shaded portion of the putting green has more annual bluegrass or Poa annua, which is the bright yellow spots or patches, than in the full sun areas. Poa annua has a compensation point 12 to 25% lower than creeping bentgrass, which helps explain why it's more competitive against creeping bentgrass in shade. In the following sections, we will look more closely at some of the topics discussed in this presentation in much more detail.